Father James Martin
Yeah.
seems very clearly to be teaching things contrary to the faith, right? Saying that two people in a same-sex relationship ought to be able to kiss at the sign of peace, and saying, I'm no theologian, but, something is only binding upon the faithful if we as a church accept it. And so therefore homosexuality might just sort of be like taking money at interest and equating it with things in Exodus, which confusing the Mosaic and the moral law.
Right.
You don't need to be a bloody theologian to figure that out. You just have to be able to go through seminary. Or if you haven't figured it out yet, to be criticized once about it ought to be enough. Okay, so you're very nice and you're very good at speaking the truth and having people like you. Most people aren't good at that. Some people are good at having people like them, but they're speaking falsities. Or they speak the truth, but people hate them, So I don't want to lead you into a place where you don't want to talk about people, that you don't want to, because, but at what point is it no longer acceptable for us not to call out people by name?
Yeah. Especially
those of us who have some modest platform, if they are leading the church into grave sin.
Yeah. No, I think that there's, if that does happen, I need to have proof, and I need to be able to point to a specific thing. So, take any one of the people that has been named. If I say, well, I'm a critic of Bishop Barron, I'm a critic of Michael Boris, I'm a critic of Dr. Marshall or of Father Martin. In what sense?
That's
because
right.
I would not critique Bishop Barron's approach of philosophy and culture to engage culture in a really clear way.
Yes.
I wouldn't critique Father Martin's desire to build bridges with a community that feels alienated and isolated from the Catholic Church.
Yes, this is a good desire.
Super good. That's so. If I'm going to critique it, I have to say, when he said this, though, this is incredibly.
Nuance doesn't go viral.
Right,
We don't like nuance. We like sledgehammers.
It's problematic or in error. Okay. So, for example, for someone to say, God made someone a certain way, that is error.
Yes.
So that's not.
Let me.
Yeah.
I'm going to read something to you.
Yeah.
Okay. Here's a direct quote from Father James Martin, and I bring this up because you wrote a book called "I Believe in."
Made for Love.
Sorry, Made for Love.
Yeah.
What's the subtitle?
Catholic Church and same-sex attraction.
Okay, so it has to do with homosexuality. So for that reason, I want you to comment on this. So this is a direct quote from him. All these Bible passages people throw at you, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and even the stuff in the New Testament where Paul talks about it once or twice, has to be understood in their historical context. The Bible is written in a particular time. It's the inspired word of God, but it is written certainly in a particular time and in a particular historical context. Certainly in Old Testament times, they didn't understand the phenomena of homosexuality and bisexuality, I would say, as we do today. I'd also like to say that there's a lot of other stuff in Leviticus that we sort of understand in its historical context. Like what kind of slaves can we have, whether or not we can wear certain kinds of clothes, whether or not our crops can be next to one another. We don't look at those passages in an ahistorical way, so why should we look at passages of homosexuality that way? I'd also like to say that in his 3-year public ministry, Jesus says nothing about the topic. All right, so there you go. Criticize that for me.
Yeah. Well, it's such an interesting. There's a way of speaking.
You can decline to criticize this. I don't need to be a dick and push you into a corner here.
It's okay. There's a way of speaking that. So when I was in college, all my professors talked like that, where it was kind of this sense of I'm going to begin by opening up what we know to be true in the sense of it's important to read the Bible in its historical context. Yep. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. And then opening it up further to saying, therefore, it means whatever I want it to mean. Or, yeah, that's essentially that. Or it doesn't mean what I don't want it to mean. And making kind of not just an emotional appeal, but this kind of the sense of like, because X, therefore Y. Where it's like, well, that's not a one-to-one kind of a situation. For example, like the fabrics thing. You can't mix fabrics in the book of Leviticus. Therefore, you also, now you can. Therefore, it's just the same thing. It's all the same. Versus actually the historical context, which would be when it came to those kind of declarations in Leviticus regarding, your hair not being, and your temples not being cut, or not mixing certain fabrics, or not eating shellfish, these kind of things. those were all in the sections of Leviticus that had to deal with how the community itself lived. When it came to the teachings on homosexuality, it had to deal with all peoples. It's so interesting, fascinating.
Right.
When you actually get to the context, it's like, let's actually take a deep dive. You said you need to be historically contextualized.
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
In that sense, what you have is some rules that were specific to the Jewish people at the time in the covenant. These other declarations have to do with all peoples, even those people amongst whom the Jews are living. And so it's like, well, that's a big difference, and that's what you're pointing to. So actually, if we do this in deep dive, then you have that.
Yeah.
The next step would be to try to address, they didn't understand the cultural context, they didn't understand this like we do. Again, let's look at the cultural context. There has always been homosexuality or homosexual acts, especially in those ancient cultures. It was by and large accepted and not seen as any big deal in Greco-Roman culture.
And Socrates, the writings of Plato, you see it. Yeah.
Right, and so you say, okay, so they lived in an even more kind of open/tolerant culture than we might have been up until the last decade. So your critique falls flat there as well. Now extrapolate that to, again, that sense of, but in the context of a loving monogamous situation, everything changes. And that doesn't hold water either, because Romans 1 doesn't talk in any way, shape, or form about whether two men are laying with each other, two women laying with each other in a monogamous loving relationship.
Yeah.
It has to do with what is the nature of sex, what's it oriented towards, and what is the opposite of that. I don't know, it's just misuse of that.
And then finally, there's the argument from silence. In other words,
Right.
a document
Exactly.
can be said to be important based on word count.
Right.
Yeah.
And Jesus didn't say anything. Capital punishment was alive and well in Jesus' day.
Yep.
He doesn't say anything about capital punishment needs to be eradicated. Slavery was present. Jesus didn't say anything about slavery being eradicated. So does that mean that
recycling, abortion, contraception?
Does that mean he's endorsing those things because he didn't speak directly against them? And
not
of course,
necessarily. Yeah.
And it's a lot of times when someone doesn't speak against something in the scriptures, it's because it's like, well, we all know that's not the case.
Yes.
It's like that's not even
It's not a point of contention.
Yeah, we all agree. If we live in the covenant, then here's what we know sex is for. We know what the marriage or relationships are oriented towards. So we don't have to fight.
Well, that's an excellent answer.
Yo, thanks for watching. You can watch the entire episode on YouTube if you want. You can listen to it at The Matt Fradd Show by subscribing on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And feel free to support me, patreon.com/MattFradd.